If I were to ask you, as a person with Asperger syndrome, what is it that you need absolutely positively the most logical people would say, I need food, I need water, I need rest. That is the fundamental, most basic thing that every Aspie needs, and you would be correct. But you got to stop and think about this. That's not unique to people with Asperger syndrome, is it? Well, no, it's not. But when you stop and think through this, what are the basic fundamental needs of people with Asperger syndrome? Well, they coincide with the same needs of everybody. Now, these were identified years ago by a psychologist by the name of Abraham Maslow in the 20th century. He was one of the most cited, quoted psychologists of his time. This is a guy who knew what he was talking about, but he approached psychology from a positive perspective. That means he didn't just study the pathologies or what was wrong with people, but he understood what was right with people and how to achieve particular goals. At first, you got to identify what we need, and so he established what is now known as Maslow's hierarchy, or the hierarchy of needs. 5 things that everyone needs. So we're going to take these 5 needs, this hierarchy of needs, and let's apply it to people with Asperger syndrome. And what we're going to uncover is people with Asperger's have very special needs when it comes to this hierarchy. For example, number 1, the most basic needs of people with Asperger syndrome is we have those physiological needs that we mentioned earlier. We've got to have food. If you don't have food, can't live. Obviously, got to have water. Got to have sleep for cell regeneration and a host of other reasons. Got to have those basics. Now, here's the challenge that we're facing. If you are an individual with Asperger syndrome, you already understand this, that getting those basic needs such as food and water requires income. And income requires having a job. And what's the one thing that Aspies struggle with among, well, not the first thing, but one of many things Aspies are known for struggling with, and that is holding down a job. That is because we go to work. We love to work. We're good workers. We have a good attitude. We show up on time. We do all that. But once we get to work, we find that others find us a little bit weird. There's something off about us. We don't socialize the way others do. And by the way, socialization is almost essential for promotion at the workplace. But we don't get promoted. We get demoted right out the door because we just don't fit into the social hierarchy that is established among every people group of any kind everywhere. And that includes work. So the very first of the 5 needs of the needs hierarchy we struggle with. I mean, that very basic need for food and water, things that we need to keep us alive. Number 2 is not just physical needs, but we also have a need for, let's call this safety and security. So once we have our basic needs met, now the first thing that we strive to discover is a way to keep safe, keep ourselves safe, to keep others from harming us. Typically, people prefer to live in safe neighborhoods. If you had a choice, where are you going to live? You're going to live in an area that's ridden with crime. You're going to live in a neighborhood that's nice and the lawns are well kept and the people are polite and everyone obeys the traffic laws and violent crime is virtually unknown. Yeah, there are neighborhoods like that in the United States and elsewhere. It's where people want to live. It can be a little costly to live in those suburban areas because there's a demand for housing there. Well, what does that do to the person with Asperger syndrome? Because he or she is struggling just to make ends meet, let alone buying a nice home in a decent neighborhood, a safe neighborhood. They have trouble finding safety and security. The third need on the hierarchy of needs is, and this one every person with Asperger syndrome is definitely going to identify with. And the third on the hierarchy is you have a need for simply belonging. everyone has a need for belonging to a group of or not of self-acceptance, but of group acceptance to have self-acceptance. So you belong to a family. You need to belong to a group of friends. Or maybe you have an affinity group of some kind, or maybe there's a church, or maybe you're involved in a group that has a cause, like a political group of some kind. So we have this drive, this need, this urge to belong to a group, but we can't belong to a group effectively until, first of all, we have those other needs met, physiological needs and safety needs. Now, why does this send up such a red flag for people with Asperger syndrome? It is because one of the needs that in which we are most challenged is what we're just talking about, that need to belong. Most people with Asperger syndrome that I've ever encountered have a very difficult time socializing with anyone, ever. I mean, as much as something as simple as small talk while you're out taking a walk somewhere and someone says hello and you see this person approaching, and before they even speak, you're thinking, I wish I were invisible. I don't want to encounter this person. So we struggle with that because we don't have social skills, we don't belong, we don't have that sense of belonging because we're rejected so often and always have been. So you go back to elementary school, and most people with Asperger syndrome were flat out rejected. They were bullied because they were different. Middle school got a little bit worse. High school, according to most people with Asperger syndrome, was the worst because that's when peer pressure sets in. And nobody wants to associate with a kid who's just a little bit off. No, when I was in school, grade school, junior high, high school, I didn't have serious problems with that. My difficulty was I just kind of invisible. I was there, but nobody seemed to realize I was there. So as Asperger's syndrome goes, I actually had it pretty good. High school, I didn't have any serious problem with bullying, no more than anybody else. But I guess I was kind of unique in those areas, almost one of a kind, because virtually every person with Asperger syndrome I've ever talked to, I've ever encountered, says that high school was the worst. It's kind of like you're taking a kid and you're sending them off to school every day to be abused. Not 24 hours a day, but 8 hours a day, however long you're in school, day after day, get the weekends off, then you go to church and be abused. Maybe you get a summer break, okay? That's a little bit of reprieve, get a little bit relief. But the point is that third tier in the hierarchy of needs is deprived to people with Asperger syndrome, usually. Number 4 is esteem. Well, if you're not accepted by a group, guess what? That fourth need that every Asperger has, that need for esteem, to be recognized, to be valued for who you are and what you contribute to the group or to society as a whole, just isn't met. In fact, if anything, it is repressed. People with Asperger syndrome have a desire, have a need for esteem, but instead of being recognized and lifted up and appreciated, they are put down, they are hated. Sometimes they are despised because they just don't fit in. Then comes the pinnacle of the hierarchy. The 5 needs in the hierarchy. Number 5 is self-actualization. To reach that point, you've got to achieve these other steps: physical needs, safety, belonging, esteem. But for self-actualization, what is that anyhow? Well, that's something akin to self-confidence. That's something akin to solid, irrepressible self-esteem. This is where we have a strong sense of self, and we're not intimidated by much of anything. That is a need of every human being. But Aspies almost never reach number 5. Number 1, they tend to be very poor. people with Asperger syndrome struggle with just paying their bills because they can't get a job and hold it. And it's kind of hard to be self-confident when you got a bill collector knocking on your door, or when you struggle just to keep the lights on, or where you can't meet your rent payment every month if you can find a place to stay. So these are the 5 things that every Aspie needs, because they are the 5 things that every human needs. But for people with Asperger syndrome, acquiring these needs that are essential is much more challenging.